All right, guys, welcome to the second quarter of the year. So our Canvas is going to look a little bit different just for the ease for both you and me. So here we have our new module for the second 9 weeks. So make sure that we're taking the pre-test first. Remember, it's a pre-test. You don't have to know anything. You're not supposed to know anything. And then we have our Edgenuity expectations. So I'm not going to put the Edgenuity grades inside our Canvas this semester, so it's not clogging up all of our grades. Instead, on Focus, I'm going to enter your overall or actual grade from Edgenuity. So your Edgenuity expectations, there are 6 modules for this unit. Coming to America, the immigrant experience, the growth of cities, living and working in cities, urban and social reforms, and political machines. And remember, these are still in the quarter 1 module on Edgenuity. So if you can't find them in quarter 2, it's because they're in quarter 1. And you should be finished with these modules by November 17th. So now we're going to go back here. So now this video, I'm going to go over Urban America PowerPoint. And then you guys are going to work on the immigration reading essentials discussion question 2-1 and the immigration quiz, and then also the urbanization one. All right, so let's look at chapter 4, Urban America. Give it a chance to load. All right, so lesson 1 is all about immigration. So from 1865 to 1914, 25 million people immigrated to the United States, mostly from Europe. People immigrated for jobs, escape restrictions of the social class, escape epidemics, religious persecution, high taxes, and famines. Many of the new European immigrants came from Ireland. Ireland had experienced a devastating famine after potato crops were ruined by a fungus. Most immigrants passed through Ellis Island in New York. It was a processing center for immigrants arriving from Europe. They were inspected by doctors, and some were forced to return home. 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island from 1892 to 1954. New immigrants changed the culture of America's demographics and workforce. Many immigrants stayed in the cities, but some moved west and became farmers in the Great Plains. The Irish were the poorest of the immigrants and usually ended up working on the railroads. By the 1890s, major cities had begun to form ethnic neighborhoods where people of the same ethnic background lived, such as Little Italy in New York City. And then you have Chinatown. I know you've heard of all those things. Immigrants settled all across the country. Some Germans came to Texas to become farmers. In 1850, Catholics made up only 5% of the population. By 1900, they made up 17%. Russian and Greek immigrants brought Orthodox Christianity to the United States. By the 1920s, 2 million Jews had settled in the United States to flee persecution. Chinese immigrants came to the U.S. in the late 1800s to flee famine, unemployment, poverty, and civil war. Most of the Chinese settled in the western United States, and many helped build the Central Pacific Railroad. Angel Island was opened in 1910 for Asian immigrants. They sometimes waited months to have an admittance hearing. An increased immigration led to an increase in nativism, which is an extreme dislike of immigrants by native-born people. It's people that were originally born in that country. They feared the many new Catholics would overwhelm the Protestant U.S., and labor unions argued that they worked for lower wages. Anti-immigrant organizations formed, many claiming to never hire an immigrant. Some members found their way into Congress. Congress passed several laws to limit the number of immigrants coming to the United States. Most were vetoed by the various presidents serving office. The Chinese Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act of 1882 were signed by President Arthur, barring new Chinese immigration for 10 years and preventing existing ones from becoming U.S. citizens. The Immigration Act also imposed a tax on new immigrants along with the authority to reject immigrants for having a criminal history, the inability to care for themselves, and the mentally disabled. Despite the persecution and other hardships faced by immigrants, many were still optimistic for their new lives in the United States. There was no widespread famine, there was no war, there were no rebellions, no restrictive social class, and even though poor, they could still improve their situation. All right, so now we're gonna watch this short video on immigration and the rise of nativism in the early 1900s. Make sure you can hear it.
New immigrant groups arriving in the late 19th century became a new target for native-born Americans who did not welcome foreigners. For reasons ranging from religious intolerance to a fear of losing their own jobs, some Americans harbored strong hatred for the newcomers. They revived a trend called nativism.
Nativism is a constant phenomenon in American history. It goes back to the colonial period. It surges in the old immigration period before the Civil War with Irish and German and other immigrant groups. And again, it surges in the late 19th century when these new immigrants begin to arrive.
As it had in years past, much of the anti-immigrant sentiment centered on economics. Some native-born Americans grew angry when immigrants would agree to work for lower wages, seeing this as a threat to their own livelihood. Other native-born saw immigrants as low-class illiterates who brought poverty and crime to America's cities. Some of these beliefs were based on widespread prejudices against immigrant religious practices.
Not only do you have more Catholics arriving, but you now have Jewish immigrants arriving, so the religious makeup of America is clearly changing.
As they had in decades past, anti-immigrant groups gained power in the late 19th century. With new names and newfound strength, these organizations would eventually gain political traction after the turn of the century.
Just as there were know-nothings in the 1850s, in the 1890s, an organization called the Immigration Restriction League is founded explicitly to pass federal laws to restrict immigration. There's also the American Protective Association, which is based out in the Midwest, principally to oppose Catholic immigration to the United States. There's clearly an organized anti-immigrant movement, and this movement will take a while, but will ultimately be successful. They will, by the 1920s, get the federal government to set up a restrictive quota system that will dramatically decrease the amount of immigrants arriving.
All right, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. So now we're on to lesson 2, urbanization. And urban means cities. You got rural, R-U-R-A-L, that means the country. So many immigrants took jobs in factories. Farmers were also moving to the cities for better paying jobs. Cities had electricity, running water, plumbing, museums, libraries, and theaters. So there was way more to do. Cities had been built up. In 1860, New York had 800,000 people living there. In 1900, 3.5 million people called New York City home. As populations grew, land development moved upward, building tall steel frame buildings called skyscrapers. Mass transit was also developed, such as trolley cars, elevated railroads, and subway systems. So this is one of the original subways in New York City. In the late 1800s, most workers in New York City were living on $500 a year. Some of the extremely rich were spending over $360,000 a year. Industrialization expanded the middle class. The middle class included doctors, lawyers, engineers, managers, social workers, architects, and teachers. Many of the middle class began moving to the suburbs on the outskirts of the cities where they could afford to buy homes. Most families lived in overcrowded tenement homes or multi-family apartment buildings. So you can see how crowded this apartment is. You got, it's 2 people right there at least, 2 people right there. You got at least 2 people right there. Very small accommodations. Whoops. Nope, that was right. 3 out of 4 people living in New York lived in tenement homes. You can see all their laundry hanging out. Many families relied on multiple salaries, sometimes meaning even the children worked. Many women found jobs as teachers, secretaries, or domestic servants. The lack of sanitation and improper sewer systems triggered epidemics of cholera and typhoid fever. So you can see even the horse is dead. They just left it in the street. Political machines formed when the population grew too fast for the city government to keep up. They provided protection, jobs, housing, and food. In exchange, the party bosses who ran the political machines asked for votes. So it's kind of like a mob mentality. Many party bosses became rich through graft, which is obtaining money through illegal methods such as fraud or bribes, and that's the wrong version of through. Corrupt bosses also sold permits to their friends to operate public utilities such as railroads and waterworks. From 1870 to 1900, it began to be called the Gilded Age. There were many new inventions, rapid industrial growth, skyscrapers, mansions, electrical lights, and everything seemed to be covered in gold. So gilded means golden. So this is the Flatiron Building. Electricity was brand new. Telephones were brand new. However, there was also corruption, poverty, crime, and great disparities between the wealthy and the working class. Everything seemed to be covered in gold, but on the inside, it was a cheaper metal. Many Americans believed that no matter how humble their beginnings, they could rise in society and go as far as their talents and commitment could take them. The rise of individualism became a strong belief in the era. You can become successful through effort. Social Darwinism was a philosophy of Charles Darwin. Evolution and natural selection led to only the strongest surviving. It was often used to justify colonialism and racism. Darwin applied Herbert Spencer's theory of evolution and natural selection to write his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, arguing that plants and animal life evolved over millions of years. Many Christians found Darwin's conclusions offensive and rejected them. Still to this day, they often do. Carnegie argued a milder version of Darwinism that he called the gospel of wealth, that wealthy Americans should engage in philanthropy, which is donations and helping other people, using their fortunes to help people and themselves. Many of the wealthy of this era used their fortunes to further culture and society. Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago. You know Rockefeller from the Christmas tree in New York, the big giant Christmas tree. That's Rockefeller Center. That's where his office building was. Stanford, Vanderbilt, and Johns Hopkins were all universities that are named for businessmen who helped to establish them. Across the nation, museums, symphonies, and operas were funded by wealthy patrons. While some supported the belief of social Darwinism, others felt that in order to fix the problems faced by Americans, the government and people would need to take a more active role. Naturalist literature drew people's attention to the problems facing American society due to rapid industrialization, such as poverty, violence, safety, disease, isolation. Many people became reformers as a result. Organizations often related around churches formed to help the poor. For example, the Salvation Army and the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA. The settlement house movement was the establishment of settlement houses for the poor. Reformers lived there with their tenants, offering medical care, recreation programs, and educational services. Jane Addams opened Hull House in 1889, which is a famous settlement house in Chicago. So let me show you a video of Jane Addams.
Jane Addams was a soft-spoken woman from a prosperous family. In 1889, she established one of the nation's first settlement houses in a poor Chicago neighborhood. In doing so, she helped to launch a philanthropic movement that continues to this day. Addams and other settlement house founders lived in the houses they founded. They taught English, provided child care for working mothers, and counseled poor immigrants who were struggling to adapt to city life in a new country. It was a new way of thinking about social work. Operating under the slogan, neighboring with the poor, the settlement founders didn't look down upon the people they were helping, but instead treated them as neighbors. As Addams wrote in her 1910 autobiography, 20 Years at Hull House, the settlement is an experimental effort to aid in the solution of the social and industrial problems which are engendered by the modern conditions of life in a great city. It insists that these problems are not confined to any one portion of the city. It is an attempt to relieve at the same time the overaccumulation at one end of society and the destitution at the other. The roots of Jane Addams' activism came from her upbringing, as well as the progressive era of social activism and political reform sweeping the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Addams grew up in rural Illinois. Her mother died when she was 2, and she was brought up by her father, a prosperous businessman with strong Quaker values. After graduating from Rockford Female Seminary in 1881, Addams became what the public and press named at the time a new woman, a young, college-educated woman who did not have many opportunities for starting her own career. So Addams decided to make her career by helping others. She began by acquiring a decaying mansion called Hull House in a neighborhood mainly populated by poor immigrants. Hull House offered neighborhood residents an art gallery, coffee house, gym, public kitchen, and a music school. But Addams realized these social and cultural services had to be supplemented by political activism to truly help the poor. Addams worked to improve education and workplace conditions, an agenda that mirrored the progressive reform movement happening on a national scale. In 1893, Addams, her activist friend Florence Kelley, and a number of other reformers in Chicago successfully pressed for a law that protected sweatshop workers and banned child labor in Illinois. Addams' reform work earned her the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Her success inspired other middle-class, college-educated women to found hundreds of settlement houses across the nation. Their work laid the foundation for the professional field of social work in the United States.
Back to lesson 3. The number of children going to school doubled between 1870 and 1900. Schools taught immigrant children English as they learned about American history in a process called Americanization. Art began to focus on realist situations like the book Huckleberry Finn, written by Mark Twain, which is a story about a runaway slave traveling the Mississippi River with a young boy. Industrialization improved the standard of living for many people, enabling them to spend money on recreational activities. And so these were the swimming suits of the era. Saloons became major political centers and places of social gatherings for young men. You gotta love the handlebar mustaches. Coney Island, an amusement park, was built in New York, and it's still there. You can still go to Coney Island. Professional sports also became popular, especially baseball and football. Vaudeville came to the US in the 1880s, which is a mix of performers, dancers, singers, comedians, and magicians. So it's like a play, it's kind of like an SNL, but live. Until the 1880s, when people were elected to office, they would fire everyone who was previously there and hire people who had supported them in what was known as the spoils system. This is politics. After the Civil War, many Americans viewed this system as corrupt. So basically, once people were elected to a new office, they would clean house. They would wipe everybody out and say, okay, you're fired, go home. I'm going to bring in my own people. President Garfield was assassinated in the 1880s by a man who was angry he had not given him a public job. Garfield's assassination stirred public opinion against the spoils system. In 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Act, requiring some jobs to be filled by taking an exam. This is now known as the civil service system. Just like I have to pass certain exams, I have 3 exams before I was allowed to become a teacher. So you still have to take an exam for some professions. In 1887, President Cleveland signed the Interstate Commerce Act, which regulated interstate commerce to protect smaller businesses. And by interstate commerce, they mean business between the states. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to curb the power of large businesses. The government had 3 types of money: greenback bonds, gold, or silver coins. We still have those. Greenbacks were paper money backed by gold. Gold and silver coins held value as they were precious metals. Today, our paper money is not backed by gold, and our coins are not precious metals. Bonds were like an IOU from the government. Inflation rose, and to curb this, the government stopped issuing greenbacks. The government didn't have enough hard currency to supply the growing economy, so deflation occurred, which is an increasing in the value of money. Farmers began to struggle as crop prices dropped and the interest rates on their mortgages rose from the shortage of money. Some farmers attempted to create cooperatives, working together to raise crop prices and lower the costs of production. Farmers formed the People's Party as they distrusted both the Republicans and Democrats. The People's Party eventually backed the Democrats in the fight over silver or gold coinage as the nation's currency. McKinley, who was a Democrat, became the President of the United States, and the People's Party declined in members. In 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike, and the last American gold rush began. The region was remote, and prospectors needed to bring a year's worth of supplies in order to not starve to death. Boomtowns with hotels, saloons, and general stores popped up everywhere. Of 100,000 prospectors, only about 4,000 discovered gold, and only a few hundred became wealthy. By 1899, the rush was over. The influx of gold made it possible to not return to the silver coin for currency. Lesson 5, talking about the rise of segregation now. After Reconstruction, many African Americans were living in poverty. Most were sharecroppers, which are landless farmers who gave their landlords the majority of their crops for rent. Many sharecroppers were in chronic debt and many left farming for other jobs. Debt means you owe money. In the 1870s, 6,000 African Americans moved to Kansas. The rights of African Americans were gradually undermined, and a movement to limit their civil rights gained momentum. The 15th Amendment prohibits states from denying citizens the right to vote on the basis of color, race, or previous servitude, which means slaves. Southern states began imposing other restrictions, poll taxes. So in order to vote, you had to pay a poll tax. Literacy tests, you had to be able to read and write. Southern states passed laws that enforced segregation and discrimination known as the Jim Crow laws. In 1883, the Supreme Court overthrew the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had prohibited barring people from public places on the basis of race. Southern states were encouraged by the overthrow and began issuing laws that limited the rights of African Americans. So that included segregation in public places, separate water fountains, and segregated railway cars. Plessy versus Ferguson upheld Louisiana law and the doctrine of separate but equal facilities for African Americans. Facilities were separate, but they were not necessarily equal, as you can see from this picture. For whites, you had this glowing water fountain with cherub angels pouring water out of the vase, and then for Blacks, African Americans, you had well water. Separate but not equal. Between 1890 and 1899, an average of 154 people were lynched, which means executed by hanging without trial every year. Ida B. Wells spoke out against lynching and pushed Congress to pass anti-lynching laws. They did not, but she was successful in bringing the awareness to the issue. Booker T. Washington said that African Americans should concentrate on achieving economic goals rather than political ones, that they should educate themselves for vocational equality. W.E.B. Du Bois argued that African Americans should not give up civil rights even for a little bit. Many African Americans worked to win the votes and end discrimination, and it would be a long struggle. And it still is a long struggle. All right, for our last thing with this video, we're gonna watch the Jim Crow laws in the South mini documentary. It's only 3 minutes, so this will give you an idea of what these people had to endure.
Millions of freed African Americans exercised their right to vote after the Civil War, and they voted for Black legislators who began to fill local and national offices.
Breaking down the extraordinary racial wedge that has for so long defined the political culture of the United States, and creating in the middle of the South a population of people, of voters, who would be voting in their own interest, voting to protect themselves in this extraordinarily hostile environment, is in fact a revolutionary accomplishment in such short a time after the war.
By the 1890s, Southern whites began to fear that Blacks with political power would try to integrate Southern society.
White Southerners are resistant of the idea of living in an egalitarian society in which African Americans might operate as equal partners.
To keep Blacks separate and powerless, Southern legislators passed what became known as Jim Crow laws. They were named after a song and dance routine called Jump Jim Crow that savagely mocked rural Blacks and was performed by whites in blackface. The laws themselves were even harder on Blacks.
They encode white supremacy through the enactment of segregation statutes, taking the vote away from African Americans, all sorts of things that are designed to subordinate Black people, to establish a place for Black people that they know, in a sense, to choreograph race relations.
Lawmakers could not violate the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying anyone the right to vote because of race. So they devised obstacles that Blacks could not overcome. States passed laws requiring voters to pay a tax or prove that they owned $500 worth of property. Other laws required people to pass literacy tests before they could cast a ballot.
In state after state, from 1890 to 1904, every state in the Deep South, the 11 original Confederate states, held state constitutions which functionally disenfranchised Black males from the right to vote.
But the southern states made sure there were loopholes in these new laws for whites. One, called the grandfather clause, allowed whites to bypass the poll tax and literacy tests. The law said if their grandfather had voted, then they could vote. At the time, no black in the South had a grandfather who had voted.
It was a gradual decision to obliterate the constitutional rights of millions of American citizens because of the color of their skin. And yet, it was a conscious decision the majority of white Southerners made because they had the power to do it.
The Jim Crow laws ensured that the promise of Reconstruction remained unfulfilled in the South for decades to come.
All right, so let's go back to our Canvas. And again, make sure that you're taking the pretest, or you've already taken the pretest. We've gone over the Edgenuity expectations. We just did the PowerPoint. So now you're going to move on to immigration and urbanization.